Most people think spiritual knowledge is the same thing as spiritual information because both can sound impressive, both can use big words, and both can make you feel like you're getting closer to something important. Yet what you were never told is that ancient mystical traditions, especially the ones connected to Gnostic thinking, treated true knowledge as something completely different from collecting ideas, because in their view, information lives in the mind, but true knowledge rearranges the person, and this matters right away because a person can memorize hundreds of teachings, repeat them perfectly, argue about them online, and still be just as anxious, just as reactive, and just as easy to manipulate as before, which is why so many people feel burned by spirituality, since they spend years learning, but their inner life stays the same, like someone reading maps without ever leaving the house. Gnostic language, the word often used is Gnosis, and the simplest way to translate it is direct. Knowing. Not I heard it, not I believe it, but I recognized it, like the difference between hearing that fire is hot and actually touching heat and never forgetting what it is, because once you've felt it, you don't need anyone to convince you, and you also don't need to threaten other people to agree with you. So, true spiritual knowledge, in this sense, is not a trophy, it's a shift in perception, and the proof is not that you can explain it in fancy terms. The proof is that you respond differently to life, because you see your fear without becoming it, you notice your pride without defending it, you feel your pain without drowning in it, and you stop needing a constant stream of approval to feel real. Makey. This easy. Imagine to people who both read the same book about swimming, and one of them can quote every paragraph, while the other gets in the water, learns what floating feels like, learns how panic changes breathing, and learns how calm changes everything. And if a storm hits, the first person has words, but the second person has skill. And the Gnostic claim is that most spirituality trains words while forgetting skill. That is why true knowledge is often quiet, because it doesn't need to sell itself, and it doesn't need to attack anyone, since it is rooted in seeing, and seeing doesn't have to shout. In this video, we're going to build a clear test, step by step, that helps you tell the difference between spiritual talk that only fills your head and spiritual knowledge that actually wakes you up, and will do it without turning it into a guru performance. Because the point is not to follow a person, it's to strengthen your own inner clarity. And if this is exactly what you've been looking for, spirituality that stays deep but still feels sane and usable in real life, then subscribe to the channel, because we're building a series of ideas that only becomes powerful when you connect the dots. Over to me, and I want here for the whole map, not just a single moment of inspiration that fades the next morning. To begin, we need one simple distinction that changes everything. The difference between knowledge that comes from outside you, like beliefs and information, and knowledge that happens inside you, like recognition and inner clarity, because once you can feel that difference, you'll start spotting false depth immediately. The easiest way to understand true spiritual knowledge is to stop treating it like a pile of ideas and start treating it like a kind of inner eyesight, because information tells you what someone claims is real, while true knowledge changes what you can actually see inside your own experience. Information's external, meaning you receive it from a book, a teacher, a tradition, or a video, and there's nothing wrong with that, because without information you can't even begin to explore. Yet, the trap is when you mistake receiving information for becoming awake, since you can repeat a concept perfectly and still live like the concept never touched you. True knowledge, in the older mystical sense, is internal, meaning it arrives as recognition, like when you suddenly notice a pattern in yourself that you've been running for years. And the moment you see it clearly, it loses some of its power, not because you forced it to go away, but because the light of awareness changed your relationship with it. To keep it simple, think of information like someone describing the taste of a lemon, while true knowledge is actually tasting the lemon, because no description, no matter how accurate, can replace the direct experience. And once you've tasted it, you can't be argued out of it, because you're not holding an opinion, you're holding contact. This is why ancient traditions often warned about spiritual talk that inflates the ego, because information can be used like decoration, making you feel advanced, making you feel special, making you feel above yet. Moment spirituality becomes a costume. It becomes a distraction, since you start protecting the costume instead of noticing what is real inside you. So here's a clean rule. If what you're learning makes you more reactive, more prideful, more anxious, or more dependent on being right, it might be information without transformation. But if what you're learning makes you more honest, more calm, more awake to your own motives, and less hungry to prove yourself, then you're closer to true knowledge, because true knowledge has a quiet effect. It reduces inner noise instead of increasing it. Another way to test it is to look at how it behaves under pressure, because information falls apart when life hits you, since your nervous system doesn't care about your favorite quotes. But true knowledge holds under pressure because it shows up as a skill, like the ability to pause before reacting, the ability to notice fear without obeying it, and the ability to tell when you're rebelled, approval seeking, or the need to control. And that's why the Gnostic idea of Gnosis is often connected to freedom, because freedom in this view is not the freedom to do whatever you want. It's the freedom to not be pushed around by the first emotion that rises, since a person who is ruled by even if they call their fear a belief. So, if we're going to build a real understanding in this video, we need to name the most common illusion first. The illusion that spiritual knowledge is something you store in your head like a library, because the moment you believe that, you start chasing more and more concepts, and you can spend your whole life collecting keys without ever opening a single door. Now, we can move into the most important practical part, what true spiritual knowledge actually does inside a person, what changes you can notice in real life, and how to recognize the difference between deep insight and a new story that simply feels deep. True spiritual knowledge, the kind the old mystical traditionspänster usually shows up in a person in ways that are almost boring. From the outside, it doesn't always create dramatic visions or loud certainty. It creates steadiness, and steadiness is easy to overlook in a world that rewards performance. So the first sign is that you become less push-button, meaning your emotions still appear, but they don't control you as easily, and you can feel irritation without turning it into cruelty. You can feel fear without turning it into panic, and you can feel desire without turning it into desperation, because something in you has learned to watch your inner weather without letting the storm drive the car. The second sign is that your relationship with truth becomes cleaner, because you stop needing truth to make you look good, and you stop needing it to make other people look bad, which is huge, because most spiritual arguments are not really about truth. They're about identity, the hidden need to feel safe, superior, or right. And when that need weakens, clarity becomes possible. The third sign is that you develop what we could call inner honesty, the ability to admit what you're actually doing inside yourself, even when it's uncomfortable, like noticing that you're helping someone for approval, or noticing that you're being kind because you're afraid of conflict. And the reason this matters is that real knowledge doesn't decorate your personality, it exposes your motives, and it does it with enough gentleness that you can face them without collapsing into shame. The fourth sign is that you become harder to manipulate, not because you become suspicious of everyone, but because you understand your own hooks, the places where fear, guilt, pride, and longing can steer you. And once you know your hooks, you stop signing emotional contracts, meaning you stop making big spiritual commitments when you're desperate, lonely, or trying to prove yourself, because you can sense that urgency is not guidance, it's a pressure tactic. The fifth sign is that you stop confusing mystery with confusion, because confusion feels foggy and anxious, while mystery can feel open and alive. And true knowledge doesn't claim to answer every question. It gives you a stable place to stand while the unanswered questions remain, which is why it often feels like peace, not like constant excitement. And notice what all of these have in common. They are not mainly beliefs, they are interchanges, which is exactly why the Gnostics called it knowledge, because it's the kind of knowing that changes the knower. Now, if this is what true spiritual knowledge looks like, the next step is to name the most common fake versions of it, the kind that sound deep but keep you trapped. Because if you can't spot the counterfeit, you'll spend years chasing what feels spiritual while becoming more anxious, more proud, and more dependent. That is the opposite of awakening. So we're going to look at 3 common counterfeits: knowledge that inflates identity, knowledge that creates fear-based dependence, and knowledge that turns mystery into entertainment. And once you can recognize these patterns, you'll be able to tell very quickly whether a teaching is leading you toward freedom or just giving your ego a new outfit. One of the biggest problems in modern spirituality is that counterfeit knowledge often feels more exciting than real knowledge, because it gives quick emotional highs, quick identity boosts, and quick answers that stop you from sitting in the uncomfortable space where true recognition actually forms. The first counterfeit is identity knowledge, the kind that turns spirituality into a badge, where you don't just learn an idea, you become the person who knows. And the moment you become that person, your mind starts defending the identity, collecting concepts like trophies, and quietly looking down on people who haven't read the same books. And this is why this counterfeit is so dangerous, because it feels like growth, while it actually locks you inside pride. You can spot it by a simple sign. If your spiritual learning makes you more obsessed with being seen as advanced, more irritated when people disagree, and more hungry to win conversations, then the knowledge is feeding the costume, not the spark. Because true knowledge makes you less dependent on image, not more dependent. The second counterfeit is fear-based knowledge, where teachings are delivered like threats, where the world is painted as a minefield, and you are told that without a special guide, a special ritual, or a special group, you are basically doomed. And what this does is create dependence, because fear makes you reach outward for authority, and once you're reaching outward from fear, you'll accept control, as if control were protection. You can spot this, one by noticing how you feel after you consume it. Because if a teacher leaves you more anxious, more paranoid, and more afraid to trust your own inner clarity, then something is off, since true knowledge can include hard truths, but it doesn't need to break you into dependence to be effective. The third counterfeit is entertainment knowledge, which is when mystery becomes a show and the goal is not transformation, it's stimulation. Meaning, you binge endless cosmic theories, secret histories, and complicated maps, and you feel like you're going deeper, yet your daily life doesn't change. Your reactions don't soften, your honesty doesn't sharpen, and your awareness doesn't become steadier because the content is being consumed. Like Gnosticism disease, where people get stuck for years because entertainment knowledge always offers another episode, another revelation, another hidden truth. And the problem isn't curiosity. Curiosity is healthy. The problem is when curiosity becomes an escape from inner work, since it's easier to watch a mystery than to sit with your own fear, your own craving, and your own need to be approved. And if you've ever felt yourself drifting toward these counterfeits, toward pride, toward fear-based dependence, or toward spiritual entertainment, you're not alone, because they're designed to hook human psychology, which is exactly why ancient mystical traditions were so serious about discernment, the skill of telling what wakes you up from what sates you. And if this is the kind of grounded clarity you want more of, take a second to like the video, because it helps this calmer, less manipulative approach reach people who are tired of spiritual content that sells anxiety or ego while pretending it's wisdom. Now, with the counterfeits clearly named, we can build something truly useful, a simple set of tests you can apply to any teaching, any book, any guru, and even any thought in your own mind, so you can tell whether it's moving you toward true spiritual knowledge or just giving you a new costume. A few simple tests you can use on any spiritual teaching, and what makes them powerful is that they don't require you to already believe anything, because they're based on what the teaching does inside you, not on how impressive it sounds. The first test is the clarity test, and it's straightforward. After you hear the teaching, do you feel more clear or foggy and scattered? Because true knowledge doesn't always feel comfortable, but it usually feels clean, like your mind can breathe, while counterfeit knowledge often leaves you either anxious or inflated, and both anxiety and inflation are forms of inner noise. The second test is the freedom test, where you ask, does this teaching make me more free from my automatic reactions? Or does it give those reactions a spiritual excuse? Because a lot of people learn a spiritual idea and then use it to justify avoidance, cruelty, or superiority. And that's a sign the teaching is being used as a costume. Since true knowledge reduces compulsion, it doesn't dress compulsion in holy language. The test, and this one is almost unfairly revealing. Does the teaching invite you to verify through your own inner experience, or does it push you to depend on a person, a group, or a system as if you are incapable without it? Because guidance can be healthy, yet dependence built on fear is a red flag, and anything that needs you powerless in order to stay true is not the kind of truth that liberates. The fourth test is the humility test. And I don't mean humility as self-hate. I mean humility as openness. Because true knowledge tends to make you less interested in performing, less interested in winning, and more interested in seeing, while counterfeit knowledge tends to make you sharper, more argumentative, and more eager to announce how awake you are, which is usually the clearest sign that the ego is driving the car. Hey! Fifth test is the integration test, and this is the one most people skip because it requires time. Does the teaching translate into your life in small, real ways, like how you speak, how you listen, how you treat people when you're irritated, how you handle loneliness, how you handle success? Because if a teaching stays in your head and never touches your behavior, then whatever it is, it hasn't become knowledge yet. Now, here's the part that makes these tests feel almost like ancient Gnosticism without needing to quote any rare texts. The goal is not to replace one set of beliefs with another. The goal is to become a person who can't be easily controlled by fear, guilt, pride, or hunger for approval, because those are the levers that keep people spiritually asleep. And the moment you start noticing those levers, you're already stepping into Gnosis, meaning direct recognition. So let's apply these tests to 3 real situations people face all the time. First, imagine you hear a teacher say, "Only my method can save you," and you feel a rush of fear, and then relief, and then loyalty, because that is the dependence hook. And the test would tell you to pause, notice the fear, and ask whether the teaching is making you stronger inside or simply making you attached to a rescuer. Second, imagine you hear a cosmic theory that is fascinating and you binge 10 hours of it, yet afterward you're still the same person, same anger, same anxiety, same craving, and the integration test tells you that you didn't gain knowledge, you gained stimulation, and stimulation is not the same as awakening. Third, imagine you hear a simple line that makes you notice your own reactions in real time, and suddenly you can pause instead of snapping. And even if that line wasn't dramatic, it changed your behavior. And that is what true knowledge looks like, because it moved from concept to perception. Now we can take the final step in this section and answer the question people rarely ask out loud. If true knowledge is inner recognition, then how do you actually cultivate it without turning it into performance? And what kinds of daily moves build real gnosis instead of more spiritual noise? If true spiritual knowledge is direct recognition, then the obvious question becomes practical. How do you cultivate it without turning it into a performance and without falling back into the same old habits of chasing approval, chasing certainty, and chasing emotional highs that feel spiritual for a moment and then fade? The first move is to build what we could call a pause muscle, because the biggest difference between a reactive life and an awake life is often one second. The second where you notice what you're about to do before you do it, and in that second you regain choice. Since most suffering is not created by what you feel, it's created by what you do automatically because of what you feel. So, instead of trying to be spiritual, start with something. When you feel a surge of anger, a surge of fear, a surge of craving, a surge of embarrassment, practice labeling it silently, like fear is here or pride is here, not to suppress it, but to stop merging with it, because once you stop merging, the emotion stops being the driver and becomes a passenger. The second move is honest observation, and this is where many people back away because it's uncomfortable, yet it's also where real knowledge is born, since you start noticing your motives without the need to decorate them, meaning you can catch yourself wanting to help someone for praise or wanting to argue to feel superior or wakaju, fear rejection. And the moment you can see those motives clearly, they lose their invisible power. The third move is reducing noise on purpose, because you cannot develop inner eyesight while blasting your mind with constant stimulation. And the ancient mystics understood this without smartphones, which should tell you how important it is, because silence is not just the absence of sound, it's the absence of manipulation. And in that absence, you can finally sense what's actually going on inside you. This doesn't mean you need to live like a monk. It can be as simple as a daily pocket of quiet, 10 minutes, where you don't feed yourself content, you don't chase answers, you don't rehearse arguments, you just sit and not chimi. You notice you got pulled into a thought, you return gently, because that return is the training, and training is what turns information into knowledge. The fourth move is testing insight in real life, because true spiritual knowledge is not proven by how it feels in a quiet room. It's proven by how it behaves when someone disrespects you, when you're stressed, when you're lonely, when you're tempted to lie, when you're tempted to perform, because that's where the old hooks show up. And if an insight can't survive those moments, it's probably not embodied yet. And the fifth move is refusing the spiritual costume, meaning you don't use your path as a way to feel above other people, and you don't use it as a way to avoid pain, because the moment spirituality becomes a way to escape your humanity, it stops being knowledge and becomes entertainment. And the moment it becomes a way to dominate others, it stops being knowledge and becomes control. Now, this brings us into something the Gnostic traditions pointed at again and again. True knowledge is less about acquiring and more about remembering, as if the mind is peeling away layers of fog until something obvious becomes visible. And when that happens, it doesn't feel like you won a prize. It feels like you stopped pretending. So the next step is to talk about the signature of true Gnosis, the kind of recognition that makes you both calmer and more courageous at the same time, and to ask a question. That's life, so you can feel the difference between spiritual knowledge and spiritual identity in a way that is impossible to forget. At a certain point, true spiritual knowledge starts to feel less like learning something new and more like waking up inside something you were already living in, because you realize the biggest prison was never a locked door outside you. It was the automatic way your mind reacted to fear, to desire, to approval, and to shame, as if those emotions had the right to command you. That's why Gnosis, in the older sense, is often described as recognition, because recognition is different from belief, since belief can be borrowed, but recognition is personal, and once it happens, it quietly changes your posture in the world, not by making you loud, but by making you harder to push. A simple example is this: before recognition, when you feel fear, you become the fear, and you act from it as if we were wisdom, yet F. You can still feel fear, but you also notice it, and the noticing on insights that space you can choose a cleaner response, and that small space is the beginning of freedom. Another signature is that you stop confusing intensity with truth, because a lot of spiritual material is intense. It hits your emotions, it gives you chills, it makes you feel like something huge is happening, yet intensity can be created by fear and fantasy just as easily as it can be created by insight. And true knowledge often arrives with a calmer feeling, like something inside you is clicking into place without drama. And here's the hardest signature to fake: true knowledge usually makes you more honest with yourself, not more impressed with yourself, because it exposes the subtle ways you try to control how you're seen, the subtle ways you avoid discomfort, and the subtle ways you use spirituality as a shield. And it does that without humiliating you, because the goal isn't to crush you, it's to unhook you. Gnostic language, the biggest hook is identification, the habit of turning passing states into me like I am my success, I am my shame, I am my role, I am my opinions. And when that habit weakens, the world becomes less personal in the painful sense, meaning you stop taking every moment as proof of your worth, and you start living from something deeper than the scoreboard. Now, this is the perfect place to bring you into the conversation, because true spiritual knowledge is one of those things people recognize in their own life long before they can explain it, and I'm curious what your experience has been. So I'd love you to comment one moment in your life, even a small one, where you realized you were reacting automatically, and then you caught yourself and did something different, or one moment where a spiritual idea stopped being a concept and became a real inner shift, because those moments are exactly what this video is describing, and seeing them from different people helps everyone feel the difference between a pretty idea and a lived recognition. And here's why that matters for the bigger theme. If true knowledge is recognition, then the greatest danger isn't not knowing enough, it's believing you know while staying asleep, because that creates the illusion of progress, and illusions are sticky. So now we can move into the closing stretch by answering a question that ties everything together. Why do ancient traditions, especially the Gnostic leaning ones, warn so strongly against being led by external authority without inner verification? And how can you stay open to guidance without becoming dependent on it? Ancient mystical traditions, especially the ones that lean Gnostic, warn so strongly about external authority for one simple reason. Authority can be helpful, but it can also become a shortcut that replaces your own inner seeing. And the moment you replace inner seeing with obedience, you become easier to control, even if the person giving the orders sounds kind, educated, or spiritual. That doesn't mean every teacher is a trap, because guidance can be real and tradition can carry wisdom, but the warning is about the relationship, not the existence of teachers, since the danger begins when you start treating someone else's certainty as a substitute for your own clarity, because then you stop verifying, and without verification, you don't have knowledge, you have borrowed belief. This is why true spiritual knowledge has a different flavor from devotion to a personality, because devotion to a personality tends to make you dependent, while true knowledge tends to make you steadier. And the cleanest test is this: after spending, do you feel more capable mind, or do you feel less capable without that teacher voice in your ear? A healthy guide does not need you confused, because confusion creates a customer, while clarity creates a free person, and free people are harder to monetize and harder to command, which is exactly why fear-based spirituality is so common. Since it sells protection, it sells certainty, it sells belonging, and it can do all of that without making you truly awake. So, how do you stay open to guidance without becoming dependent? The first move is to treat every teaching as a hypothesis, not a law, meaning you can listen with respect, but you keep a quiet inner space that asks, does this match my dois it make me more free inside? Because if it doesn't, then even if it sounds beautiful, it may be information that doesn't become knowledge for you. The second move is to refuse urgency, because urgency is one of the favorite tools of manipulation, spiritual or otherwise. And if someone pushes you to commit quickly, to fear quickly, to worship quickly, or to cut off your own questioning quickly, that's a sign you're being steered, not guided, since real truth can handle time, and real truth doesn't need. You rushed. The third move is to watch what the teaching does to your compassion, because true knowledge tends to soften cruelty and reduce the need to dominate, while false knowledge often increases judgment, tribal thinking, and superiority. And you can spot this by noticing whether you are becoming more patient with people or more irritated that others don't get it. Fourth move is to keep returning to the simplest inner practice we've mentioned again and again, noticing what you're feeling before you act, because every time you catch fear, guilt, or pride before it drives you, you are building the kind of inner verification that no institution can hand you. And once you have that, you can learn from anyone without becoming anyone's property. And that takes us directly into the final stretch of the video, because now we can bring everything into a clean summary, show what true spiritual knowledge looks like in one sentence you can remember, and end with a question that helps you measure your own path without shame, without ego, and without performance. If we compress everything we've said into a single map you can actually use, then true spiritual knowledge is not knowing more, it is seeing more clearly. And the clearest sign you're moving toward it is that your life becomes less driven by fear, guilt, pride, and the need to perform, because those forces are basically the strings that make human beings easy to pull. So here is a simple way to hold it. Information sits in your mind like a book on a shelf, while true knowledge changes the way your mind meets reality, because it gives you a quiet space between what you feel and what you do, and inside that space you can choose something cleaner than your old reflex. That's why the best test of spiritual knowledge is not whether you can explain the universe, it's whether you can meet an ordinary moment differently, like being criticized without collapsing shame, being praised without becoming addicted, being afraid without rushing into bad decisions, being lonely without begging for a story that makes you feel important, and being wrong without turning it into a war. If you look closely, all the counterfeits we named fail this test in the same way. Identity knowledge makes you sharper, more defensive, and more dependent on the image of being awake, which means it doesn't free you, it just gives your ego a new job title. Fear-based knowledge makes you dependent on protection and permission, which means doesn't wake you up. It trains you, obey, and obedience can look spiritual while still be arcade. Entertainment knowledge makes you fascinated but unchanged, and fascination without integration becomes another kind of sleep, because you're still outsourcing your inner work to content. So true spiritual knowledge, in a grounded sense, is the kind that passes the integration test, meaning it shows up in the way you speak, the way you listen, the way you handle discomfort, and the way you relate to your own mind when nobody is watching, because if it only exists when you're talking about it, it's not knowledge yet, it's still performance. And that is why the ancient emphasis on direct recognition matters so much, because recognition is the one thing nobody can hand you as a finished product, since a teacher can point, but only you can see, and that's not a romantic slogan, it is a practical truth, because the moment you can see your own hooks clearly, they lose their invisible power, and you stop being dragged around by them like the artifici. Close. The goal is not to give you one more concept to collect, The goal is to leave you with one clean standard you can apply to your own path. Does what you learning make more awake, ordinary life more steady under pressure, and more honest without becoming harsh? Or does it just give you a more impressive story to tell? So, if you want the cleanest truth behind the phrase, true spiritual knowledge, it's this. It isn't measured by how much you can explain. It's measured by how much you can see, because seeing changes you without needing a performance, while explanation can grow endlessly even when your inner life stays stuck. That's why, in the older, mystical sense, knowledge was treated like an awakening, not like a collection, because the moment you genuinely recognize what fear is, what pride is, what guilt is, and how those forces steer you, you don't need to hate them or fight them of their control. You simply stop giving them the right to drive, and that shift, quiet as it is more powerful than 10,000 impressive theories. So here's a simple sentence you can carry. True knowledge gives you space. Space between impulse and action. Space between emotion and identity. Space between what someone tells you and what you can verify inside your own experience. And in that space you become less controllable, less reactive, and more honest, which is why so many traditions treated inner clarity as sacred, because clarity is what breaks the spell of manipulation. And if you want a practical way to test your own path, starting today, you don't have to change your beliefs overnight. You just have to observe one thing vittless when you feel triggered. Do you notice it and choose? Or do you merge with it and obey? Because that single difference is where spiritual knowledge becomes real instead of remaining a pretty idea. So the final question I want to leave you with is not meant to pressure you. It's meant to orient you. When you look at your spiritual life, are you becoming calmer and more clear in ordinary moments, especially under stress? Or are you simply becoming better at talking about spiritual things while your reactions stay the same? And if you want more videos that keep spirituality deep, but still practical, without fear selling, without ego games, and without turning mystery into entertainment, then it really does help to subscribe to the channel, because this kind of understanding is built over time, and I'd rather build it with you than leave you with 1,000 disconnected ideas.